Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel in another episode of The Horror Corner with Jess Darling. I'm Jess, and today we're taking a deep dive into Eli Roth's History of Horror, a Shudder original series that looks at the roots and the evolution of all our favorite horror subgenres. One of my favorite subgenres as a fan of horror in general, but it's specifically as a fan of practical gore effects, is known as body horror, a phrase which was coined by Philip Brophy in his 1983 article on the emergence of horror, body horror specifically, as a subgenre. And it encompasses a wide range of films, not just, the obvious, from Society and The Ice Cream Man by Brian Usna to more mainstream films that people, outside of horror communities might have seen, like The Fly by body horror granddaddy David Cronenberg, and the Saw series, created by my personal horror OTP, James Wan and Lee Wanell. Between the two of them, they have owned the possession subgenre. Like, they just, out of the park. Both of them. Together, the Saw series, perfect. Body horror as a genre, as a subgenre, typically focuses on not only the limits, but the transformative capabilities of the human body, which lends itself to, a lot of different kinds of stories, including infections, zombies, aliens, torture porn, possession movies, and pretty much any slasher featuring the work of either Screaming Mad George, who is a frequent Brian Usna collaborator, or the gore daddy himself, Tom Savini. It's unquestionably a queer genre, with writers like Clive Barker, who is openly gay, tearing up the 80s with their violent psychosexual takes on what closeted queerness can do to a person's mental health, and the battle between embracing one's queerness and succumbing to heteronormativity. That's really, makes body horror specifically really relatable to queer people. And one of the things that makes me love this subgenre even more is that its roots begin not only within queerness, but within womanhood. Women are meant to be pure and demure, and they're meant to be seen and not heard. But it was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that not only gave birth to science fiction and horror as genres, but would specifically come to influence the kinds of minds that would give us movies like The Human Centipede and scenes like The Shunting from Society. Men like to think that women and people with uteruses who are heavily socialized as women don't have a basis of understanding violent urges and growing into a drive to pursue those urges, despite being told it's not for you and will make you undesirable. But I'd argue that anyone who comes from a place of privilege regarding being able-bodied, being cishet, being a man, claims that they fully understand and appreciate the themes in, throughout body horror films. They're straight up, they're either lying or they're just pretentious and they think they get it and they don't. because I don't understand how these people who come from a place of who are positioned from a place of privilege, how themes of sickness and the aging body, how they could find that relatable in any way when their bodies are not only seen as the default, but able-bodied men, cis men specifically, their bodies are just less complicated by nature. They just are. And, you know, that sort of leaves me wondering what is there in body horror that resonates. The closest I can come to thinking, you know, to a cishet man whom I understand is being upset that he no longer looks the way he does due to the passage, or the way he did due to the passage of time. Which brings me to my next point, a real life example of how this obsessive fear of and drive to avoid the aging process plays out in public, is how utterly and absolutely Johnny Depp stands just flat out refuse to acknowledge that he doesn't look attractive anymore, that he's over the hill. The violence they've doled out to Amber Heard, her supporters, and even the friends that she has left, the few friends that she has left, would make the perfect basis for a meta horror comedy. Or a revenge horror, a la French extremity horror Revenge, which was actually directed by a woman. These stories need to be told by women, by marginalized people, in order for them to not just be, you know, privileged punching down. The horror film genre equivalent of punching down. But unfortunately, currently, female directors are not very prominent in the body horror and splatter subgenres, which I am hoping will change in the future, because there's a lot of good, like, Revenge was very, very, very gory. It was very bloody. Like I said, directed by a woman. So, you know, again, it really is kind of ironic that men would think that a woman couldn't tell that story in a way that resonates with more than just people who've experienced, you know, the scenario in the movie. And this next point that I'd like to make about body horror is something they touch on deeper in the series, in the Shudder series, Queer for Fear, which I'll also be breaking down in future videos. But I also want to talk about a little bit about it here, is how transformation stories can also embody elements of body horror. And that's something that's deeply relatable to me, not because of my gender exploration. I don't have such deep dysphoria that it's relatable that way, but it's also relatable because of the progression of my body breaking down due to chronic illness. So movies like Raw, like Ginger Snaps, like The Wolfman, these ideas, these themes of being disgusted by what you turn into after you develop a disability later in life, as opposed to being born disabled, and the process of unpacking the internalized feelings that you have about that, unpacking internalized ableism is something that is really, really hard, especially for people who develop disabilities. It's quite like the feeling people get left with after watching a good body horror, at least in my experience. I've learned to embrace discomfort and appreciate it for what it's trying to teach me, so I don't see that as a bad thing. I can see that that is a large part of why people are turned off by body horror. They don't want to sit with the discomfort of what this gore and this violence and this blood represents. That's really the long and short of it. And if we're talking about just the filmmaking aspects of splatter and body horror, you can see horror's influence all over the Marvel Cinematic Universe, thanks to creators like James Gunn, whose 2006 Slither is a masterclass in practical gore effects. That film just blows me away every single time I watch it. Sam Raimi, whose horror influence is literally the only thing that made Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness worth watching. And it's what sets that movie apart for me from the rest of Phase 4 and what makes it better than the rest of Phase 4 for me. Sam Raimi was brought up on insanity charges in the UK for Evil Dead. Hey, I watch Evil Dead now, especially compared to the remake, right, which was infinitely more of a splatter horror than the original. And people want to say that horror isn't relevant, that it isn't influential, and I'm going, hey, if you are going to turn your nose up at the influence of body horror, especially because it's gross and uncomfortable and whatever, you have no business talking about the special effects in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, in order to be able to criticize something properly, you have to appreciate its history. And it's really clear to me, egregiously clear to me, that the people who continue to criticize the visual effects in the MCU don't, and who continue to criticize horror as a genre for being irrelevant, clearly just have no idea what they're talking about. And they haven't done their research and they haven't done their due diligence knowing about the history. And, frankly, people who don't know the history about horror and who haven't put in the effort to sit through the black and white and the slow burns and whatever, I'd rather those people not keep talking about horror. I'm done with those kinds of conversations when it comes to horror. They're surface level, and this genre has such a rich history. To ignore it does a disservice anyway. So and then if we think about it this way, 2022, body horror has taken on an even more disconcerting and terrifying shape as the world struggles to come to terms with the mass disabling nature of the ongoing COVID crisis. This, combined with the moral panic around the mere existence of transgender folks, I have to say, body horror and splatter horror seems more relevant now than it ever has before, and has the potential to be more viscerally terrifying than ever before. There are, of course, valid reasons not to enjoy splatter and body horror. I understand that, but I'd also suggest that if the person you're speaking to comes from a place of privilege, if that someone is unwilling to examine further why body horror makes them so uncomfortable, and why the ideas and the themes of aging, disability, and gender transformation disgust them so much, if they're unwilling to examine that, just maybe consider that if they come from a place of privilege, they might also be waving other red flags that you really should be paying attention to. Just saying. I've never been a fan of Dario Argento. Like, I've never had any desire to really get into giallo or anything like that. Like, I really liked Suspiria, but I always chalked it up to the fact that Suspiria is supernatural in nature, right? These are witches that are in a coven that are, trying to attract young girls and blah, blah, blah. I did not expect when I saw the Dario Argento giallo Tenebrae on Shudder, it's on Shudder, but it was on the list of top 20 splatter horror films of all time. And I just thought, well, that seems like an interesting place to start because I like the premise, which is that an author goes to Rome, and at the same time that a series of brutal murders based on his book that he just published starts occurring. And so based on the premise, I was like, well, this is interesting. It kind of sounded like a non-supernatural version of In the Mouth of Madness, which is one of my favorite horror films of all time. So if you're curious to learn more about how body horror and the Italian style of giallo films kind of evolved alongside each other, I'm gonna do a deep dive, and I'm gonna do a breakdown of Tenebrae. It was really, really well done. I liked it a lot. So if you're interested in hearing about giallo and more about Dario Argento, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you don't miss either video. I'm going to be real with you. I can't promise consistent uploads. So if you want to make sure that you don't miss my content, please, please, please make sure to hit that notification bell. I will also be breaking down the next episode of History of Horror, which is my favorite episode of the series so far. Sequels don't suck. So we'll be talking a little bit more about sequels and going in depth into horror movie sequels that work and ones that don't. Like I said earlier, I'm also going to be breaking down Queer for Fear, going into more of the history of queer influence in horror cinema, because a lot of the reasons why horror is so informed by queer culture is because queer directors and producers and editors and all that who weren't getting a leg up because they were openly queer in the 70s and 80s. Horror was the genre that would take them, right? Like how actors will say, you start out in porn, or you're, gay for pay until you start making it as a bigger actor. It's the same concept. The major studios that were producing these big budget, blockbuster films weren't weren't even letting queer people who were openly queer through the door, or who were trying to tell openly queer stories, weren't even letting these people through the door. So I really want to, kind of look into the history of the horror community being a safe space for people who are not normal, quote unquote. I'm also going to be doing a Halloween episode of my podcast on Halloween Ends and how I feel about the series and the reaction to the series, and just go into some of my unpopular opinions about that franchise on the podcast. So make sure that you are subscribed on Anchor if you're not already, or you can look it up and follow, I think, on pretty much every major platform where you would be listening to podcasts. Also, go follow me on Instagram. That's the only social media I have left that I'm really putting any effort into at the moment. It is still a bit under construction, but it's going to be my main hub of social media and updating stuff about my channel, so make sure that you follow me there as well. If you are here for neurodivergent content, have no fear, I have not forgotten you. I have a deeply personal episode prepared, or I'm going to prepare it. I want to talk about context blindness, because I think that it's a difficult concept to understand, while at the same time being singularly the number one most crippling thing to me as an autistic person. Like, the thing that I find the most disabling from a social standpoint of this context blindness. And let me tell you, when I realized how badly having context blindness was affecting my relationships without me knowing it, like, this aha moment, you're gonna want to make sure that you are subscribed and getting notified so you don't miss that episode either. So thanks again. I should have that episode up and ready to go by the first week of November, if by any chance for whatever reason, you're one of those people that doesn't like notifications. So check back for that first week of November. I will definitely be making sure that episode gets pushed out. So thanks again for showing up, and I look forward to seeing y'all in the next episode.